So there's an illusion here. So goes this devil's advocate
Sure.
argument. You're not really treating the thing, and there are deleterious negative consequences. And by the way, those people who did those crimes are also people too. Their welfare should count in our
Sure.
calculation. We can't just throw them on a dustbin of human debris and forget about them. We can't just clang the jail door shut and wipe our hands and pretend as if we are somehow doing justice. That's not justice. Hey there, Ralph. How you doing, man?
I'm doing very well, sir. How are you?
Doing well, thank you. Good morning to you. This is Glenn Loury. You have tuned into The Glenn Show. We're sponsored by the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research in New York City, where I am John Paulson, Senior Fellow, and where Ralph is my colleague, Rafael Mangual, who is my colleague at the Manhattan Institute. And he is, what are you now? You are Senior Fellow and Head of Research for the Policing and Public Safety Project at the Manhattan Institute and author of Criminal Injustice, What the Push for Decarceration to Depolicing Gets Wrong and Who It Hurts the Most, a new book that's out that everybody should read. And I'm happy to be talking with you here. Hi, hey, Ralph, how you doing, man?
I'm doing well. Extremely happy to be on with you, as I am a huge fan of the show and your work. So this is truly an honor.
Thank you. So what's the Manhattan Institute like as a place to work? You've been there for a while. I've only just signed on recently and have yet to actually set foot in the premises of the offices in Manhattan of the Manhattan Institute now in my new capacity as a senior fellow. So I'm curious as to how you experience the place and what's going on there.
Best job in the world, honestly. I wake up every day and I'm just so surprised and relieved to be doing the work that I get to do where I get to do it. I mean, you don't know this about me, but the Manhattan Institute was on my radar back when I was in college, when I first kind of got engaged in these debates about policing and criminal justice. And that was one of the institutions whose work I first came across, through the work of George Kelling and James Q. Wilson, John DiLulio. And, so right around the time I was about 19, 20, I kind of realized that, professional baseball wasn't going to happen and I should start figuring out what I wanted to do with my life. And, I loved to argue. I loved, to engage with my peers. And I thought, well, hey, there are these things called think tanks, and maybe I should look into a career in one of those. And the Manhattan Institute just always appealed to me. I mean, for obvious reasons. One, I'm a born and raised New Yorker. Grew up in Brooklyn, and just absolutely loved the city, and so that was a huge part of it. But the Manhattan Institute, I always saw as kind of doing the really hard work of getting to the bottom of debates through the use of data and empiricism, and in a way that had a sort of special place for urbanism and understood the role that urbanism plays in the country. And I just wanted to be part of something like that. And so I got very, very lucky in that while I was in law school, I got to intern at the Manhattan Institute and did some work that happened to catch the right people's eye, and was able to sort of shortcut what I expected to be a very long process of practicing law, and sort of developing an expertise that I could eventually parlay into a career at a think tank, and came to MI straight out of law school in 2015. And it's been just a really collegial place to work. I mean, you're surrounded by brilliant people, so at least I was very, very intimidated at the outset. I mean, talk about, imposter syndrome. My first boss, Jim Copeland, 2 degrees from Yale, 1 from LSE, and just, one of the highest IQs of people I know. And it was just like, how am I supposed to impress, people like this? How can I be a peer to someone like that? And I realized that very quickly that, mentorship is just a huge part of the culture at MI. There was no real pride of authorship. People take you under your wing. They help promote your work. I mean, it really, truly is one of the best places to be.
Did you have a political orientation that leaned right of center? May I just ask, prior to coming into the MI?
Yeah, for sure. I'd say I became politically aware somewhat late in life. I don't think it was that late, but if you look at, high schoolers now, they're out marching, carrying signs, and they seem to have it all figured out. I didn't really care about politics until I was about 19, 20 years old, my second year of college. And it was really through this issue that I write about now that sort of sparked my interest and led me down the road of reading that would, sort of eventually lead me to develop a kind of classical liberal sensibility. The thinkers that most appealed to me then and still appeal to me today, people like John Stuart Mill, John Locke, you know, more contemporary writers, 20th century William F. Buckley, Tom Sowell, folks like that really kind of helped me form my thinking on a lot of these issues. So yeah, I'd say I'm something of a conservatarian. Charles Cook sort of coined that term to describe people who sometimes felt to the left of sort of the typical evangelical conservative that people think of when they use the term conservative, but to the right of the kind of left libertarians, anarcho-capitalist types. So somewhere in that happy medium.
Where'd you go to law school, Ralph?
DePaul University in Chicago.
I know it. I'm a Chicago born. I remember DePaul.
Yep.
Yeah.
I married a Chicagoan. My wife, Joyanette, who is a charter school principal, works with Ian Rowe, actually, opening up his new school in the Bronx. She is originally from the west side of Chicago, Humboldt Park. And we met when she was here in New York doing Teach for America. And she made very clear at the outset of our relationship that she wanted to move back to Chicago. So at the time, I was getting ready to apply to law school, and I quickly added DePaul to the list about 2 nights before the deadline for the application. And when I got my acceptance, that's where I matriculated. And little did we know we'd end up moving back to New York 4 years later. But
I was going to say, you must be doing something right if you convinced her to abandon Chicago.
I did. Well, I'm a beneficiary of wearing my heart on my sleeve. And so she always knew from the very beginning how much I loved the work of the Manhattan Institute. I was always talking about it, always, talking about how I wanted to do this one day. So when I got the job offer, it was a lot of the groundwork had already been laid. I didn't have to do too much convincing to get her to agree to let me pursue this dream. So I'm a lucky man.
Yes, well, I'll bet you are. Okay, so the book. Criminal Injustice. You have in parentheses. There's a kind of irony there. The natural response of many people to watching the secular increase in the numbers of people behind bars in the United States that took place from, let's say, 1980 to 2000, where you go from 500,000 to 2 million that are lock and key on a given day, that's a bad thing. That's mass incarceration. That's the mobilization of punitive resources by the state in response to the problem of maintaining public order that is unmatched by any other society, democratic, wealthy, Northern European, et cetera. We compare. The United States is a vast outlier. 5% of the world's population, 25% of the people under lock and key. 3 strikes and you're out. Massively punitive state intervention with a huge racial disparity. Blacks are almost the order of magnitude more likely to be incarcerated, and so on. How is that not just obviously a bad thing? I mean, I can recite this case because I've made this case in my own writing in years past, and I haven't disavowed all of it. And I'm just wondering, I looked at the interview you did with Trevor Noah on The Daily Show, and I was watching his facial expression. I mean, and it was like, come on, brother. It was like he was saying, come on, brother. So I'm saying, now, come on, brother. Come on, what's up with that? You defending the prison industrial complex?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I would use that term, but so there are a lot of layers to this argument. So the first one is whether punitive is the right word to fully describe the response that led to the uptick in incarceration in the United States. And it's very easy for us to kind of look at these numbers, compare, look at these international comparisons, say, compare the U.S. incarceration rate to, some other Western European democracies, England, Wales, Germany, France, and, and come to the conclusion that we're just an overly punitive society. I'm just not sure that's right. I mean, even back during the uptick, it's been pretty consistently the case, for example, that only 40% of state felony convictions result in a post-conviction prison sentence. So the most common outcome of a conviction for a felony is not post-conviction incarceration. When you look at the people who actually do get incarcerated, they don't get incarcerated for very long. The median prison sentence in terms of time actually served in the United States is 16 months. Now, 16 months is a long time to be locked up, especially if you're used to freedom. But when you consider the sort of crimes that most prisoners are actually incarcerated for, as well as the sort of length and seriousness of their criminal histories, it actually doesn't seem all that punitive at all. And, the criminal history point is really important because part of the narrative about incarceration in the United States is that we are a country that systematically denies people second chances, right? We have second chance month in the United States. The idea being that, you have all these first time offenders who are just, getting locked up and the key getting thrown away over some minor nonviolent offense. You hear a lot about, nonviolent drug offenders, for example. But if you look at the criminal histories of the typical person leaving a state prison today, you'll find that individual has somewhere between 10 and 12 prior arrests and 5 and 6 prior convictions. These are not people who've been denied second chances, right? These are people who have gotten plenty of second chances and then some. The question then becomes, at what point is it immoral to continue to take risks with the lives and property and bodily integrity of the people that these individuals will very likely victimize if we continue to release them? And that's the concern that primarily motivates my work. Now, on the punitive point too, I think it's worth mentioning that one of the reasons we're such an outlier on incarceration is because we're such an outlier on really serious violent crime, right? This is something that, even the most progressive critic of incarceration in the US will remember in the context of a different debate, that debate being gun control. We consistently hear how much worse we are in terms of our serious violence rate compared to England or France or Germany. And that actually goes a long way toward explaining why we have so many more people incarcerated, because the risk of failing to incarcerate people, especially after repeated criminal behavior, is more likely to be a murder committed with a gun here in the US than it is in another part of the world. And that's something that we have to control for. I mean, we also have to control for wealth too, right? I mean, the United States is uniquely situated in the world as one of the just wealthiest nations. And so we have a lot of resources to dedicate to our criminal justice apparatus, to our police, to our court systems, to our, forensics teams, all that stuff that, helps make these cases and process them at a volume that can produce this kind of criminal activity. And despite all that investment, it is still the case that the vast majority of serious crime in the United States, doesn't get reported. And the vast majority of the crimes that do get reported don't get solved. They don't result in an arrest. But if you just look at the violent index felonies that are tracked by the FBI, only about 17 to 18% are cleared in a given year. Right. And again, when you look at the statistic that only 40% of state felony convictions result in a prison sentence, we're not actually incarcerating a huge share of the people who are committing the most serious crimes. And, if we're going to continue down the road of the international comparisons too, I think it's worth noting that a lot of countries around the world, even ones that we're unfavorably compared to, are just as, if not more punitive on many interesting measures. So, in the book, I give the example of Germany, which actually sentences a higher proportion of those convicted of first-degree murder to life in prison than does the U.S. I also give the example of the United Kingdom, where the mandatory minimum sentence for illegal firearm possession is 5 years, of which you can be expected to serve 3.5 years. Now, that's something that's regularly met with probation sentences today. People are getting diverted for those sorts of crimes left and right in the United States. So, we just have a lot more of the kinds of violence that informs these decisions because that's the risk that we're trying to minimize. And if you just look at the data on violence and how concentrated it is, the US is unfortunately home to just many, many more pockets of serious concentrated violence. And so I do this analysis in the book where, I take a handful of neighborhoods in 4 American cities, and you get a 0.3% of the combined population of England, Wales, and Germany. And yet you have in those handful of neighborhoods of just 4 American cities, 10% of the homicides seen in all 3 of those countries, which is, I think really important to contextualize why our incarceration rates are so high. And I know there were a couple of other points that you raised there that I'm forgetting in this response. So,
Well, let me see if I understand. We are only apparently an outlier. In fact, if you look carefully at comparisons between countries, have a lot more violent crime, and conditional on the level of crime, we're not, at least not in every respect, more punitive than some of our countries that we compare ourselves to. But I want to ask, in the spirit of friendly devil's advocacy here, is prison the answer? You're putting a lot on incapacitation. Don't they
Yep.
teach us about deterrence? They teach us about rehabilitation, and they teach us about retribution. Back in the day, when I was inveighing against mass incarceration, I was very concerned with the politics of retribution, with the idea that criminals would be painted as these demonic figures and that people would be riled up and given a false sense of security through the expression of punitiveness through our politics and our policy. But then when we actually looked at the effect of prisons, crime is criminogenic. This is one of Bruce Western, the sociologist at Columbia University who works on criminal justice issues from a left of center point of view, is one of his principal points. You actually make people worse, less fit. They don't stay. You make that point yourself. The average length is 2 years or so of a prison sentence. So people are back on the streets. They're connected to other people. They go into communities. The character of life in those communities is affected by what is going on inside the prisons. People are hardened in their attitudes and whatnot. A certain culture is fueled that is, not healthy for the youngsters who are growing up around it and all like that. So even if you're right to stress that there is more violent crime, which requires a response, why is it so obvious that locking more people up is the appropriate response?
Yeah, I think the best answer to that question is to lean into the incapacitation point, because prison is the best and really the only way to reliably prevent the sort of crimes that we're worried about being committed in the absence of this kind of response, right? There's a lot of talk about rehabilitation in the United States, and that is certainly something that we should continue to pursue and invest in. But I think the most serious scholars will tell you that if you read the literature honestly, what you will be forced to conclude is that we don't really know how to reliably rehabilitate the typical prisoner in the United States. And certainly we don't know how to do that at scale. Again, we have 1.9 million people under lock and key on a given day in this country. That's a lot. The idea that we have ready, deployable rehabilitation programs that will reliably reduce the risk to, a level of comfort that everyone is okay with, if we're going to pursue the sort of mass scale decarceration that people want to pursue. I just don't think that exists. And so, rehabilitation is one of those things that, yes, it's one of the 4 sort of penological justifications for incarceration, but it's not one that we've figured out. And so until we do that, I think we owe it to communities to provide the protection that is associated with the removal of criminal actors, particularly high-rate offenders and offenders who pose a high risk of committing serious violence, from the street for as long as possible. The deterrence point, I think, is certainly important, general deterrence. There's a lot of research that shows, for example, that simply giving someone a sentence that's 6 months longer or a year longer isn't going to reduce their likelihood to reoffend, compared to the person who gets the shorter sentence. That's true, but again, it's that doesn't that leaves aside the point of incapacitation, right? That if that person's committing 10 index felonies a year, that extra 6 months means that the community that they would go to is spared 5 of those serious crimes. But the general deterrence point, I think, is also very real. I mean, if you really raise the transaction cost of criminal behavior a significant degree, where the difference is not just 6 months or a year, you can actually, reduce crime pretty significantly. I think one of the best studies on this is the study of the 3 strikes regime in California, done by Heelan and Tabrock in 2007. What they find is that there is a 17 to 20% reduction in the likelihood of a rearrest for somebody who has 2 strikes compared to similarly situated offenders with 0 strikes or 1 strike. That's a meaningful difference. Now, we can argue about the wisdom of 3 strikes. Maybe 3 strikes isn't the right number. Maybe it's 5. But as I say in the book, I mean, the main concern driving my work are the terrible crimes that are committed by people who have been given many, many, many bites at the apple. Individuals who have proven time and again through their repeated criminal conduct that they have no intention whatsoever of playing by society's rules. I open the book with the story of a woman in Chicago who was murdered. She was caught in a drive-by shooting. And it is one of the most tragic things you'll ever see. It was caught on video. She's holding her 1-year-old daughter, and here comes this car, and the passengers open fire. She takes off, is wounded almost immediately, collapses with her daughter still clinging to her, and essentially bleeds out in the street, is dragged to a hospital in front of her 1-year-old daughter, and is pronounced dead. Now, the shooting was caught on video, so they were able to make an arrest. The woman's name was Brittany Hill, just 24 years old. Now, one of the defendants charged in that murder was a guy named Michael Washington. He had 9 prior felony convictions, Glenn. 9. One of them was for second-degree murder. Another one was the result of an attempted murder charge that was pled down to aggravated assault. I mean, this is someone that I think the average American reads this story and says, what is he doing out on the street? And they're surprised and they're shocked. And what I want people to understand is that surprise and that shock is misplaced, because this is a regular outcome of how we do criminal justice in the United States. I know we hear a lot about the punitive outcomes. I know we hear a lot about the Khalif Browders of the world, but that is not the typical experience. And so, we have to understand what the risk is that we're trying to mitigate. Now, yes, it is true that for some subset of offenders, the experience of prison can be criminogenic. It can make them worse off, insofar as they will reoffend at a higher rate than they otherwise would have if they were diverted. But to me, that doesn't obviously lead to the conclusion that we should decarcerate. And there are a couple reasons for that. One is that, as you're the economist here, but if you're trying to assess what the effect of a given treatment is, in this case, exposure to incarceration, you want to figure out a way to create a natural experiment, right? Because that decision's never random. Right? There are good reasons that people who get incarcerated are put in prison, and there are good reasons that people who are diverted from the system are diverted. And so, it's very hard to just look at who goes to prison and compare them to who doesn't, because there may be factors that we're not, catching up on. And so the literature has developed, with these random judge assignment studies, right? So, essentially what you do is you sort of look at a population of offenders who are on the margins of incarceration, people whose conduct is not so serious that it's obvious that they're going to go to prison, but people whose conduct is not so minor that it's obvious that they're going to get diverted. And then you look at the leniency and the severity of the judges in that jurisdiction who are randomly drawing these cases. And if you compare the outcomes of similarly situated defendants who are on the margins of incarceration, who draw harsh judges and are incarcerated, to the outcomes of those who draw lenient judges and are diverted, you do see higher rates of reoffending for those who are exposed to incarceration. But the conclusions that we can draw from that literature are limited, because there's a difference between someone who's on the margins of incarceration and the typical prisoner in the United States today, right? The typical prisoner in the United States today is much more likely to be a higher risk proposition when you're talking about release than the people that are captured by these studies. And so I think we make a serious error by grafting those findings onto the broader debate as if we can conclude, as if those studies justify the conclusion that mass decarceration for its own sake is an endeavor that comports with the majority of the public's concerns about public safety. And the last thing I'll say is on the retribution point. I'm not a retributivist at heart. I mean, it's the bottom of the list of things that I care about. That said, I do think it's important for society's desire to achieve retribution to be satiated, because I don't want to live in a world in which you get this kind of death wish culture of vigilante justice, which I think predominates in a lot of America's highest crime neighborhoods. People are essentially taking justice into their own hands. Oh, you stole from me. Well, we're going to settle this not in court, but I'm going to pull up on you when you're not expecting it. You're going to get caught lacking, and I'm going to open up. And I don't want to live in that world. I don't want that to be a more common thing than it is. And I think that if society is satisfied that the criminal justice system is appropriately responding to terrible criminal conduct, one, backlashes are going to be less likely, and backlashes I agree, are not good. But two, you're going to minimize the chances of vigilante violence, and that's something that I think is good.
Okay, 3 strikes is okay with you, huh? You say a study finds that if a person has 2 strikes and is susceptible to a third, that their behavior looks different than a randomly drawn person because the threat of that third strike has an incentive effect. And I'm thinking 25 years to life for 3 felony convictions. I'm going to give the prison gerontologist a lot of business. I'm going to give the person who's incarcerated at the age of 60 and is much less likely to offend. I'm still confining him because I'm following through on my 25 years to life commitment for 3 strikes. For every case of the one that you open your book with, horrible, horrible victimization of a person by a repeat offender, can I not find a case of somebody who at the age of 19 sitting in the backseat of a car where the 2 guys go in to rob a convenience or a filling station and they shoot the attendant? Now he's got a felony murder rap when the car gets pulled over and he's sent away for life without the possibility of parole or whatever. Can I not find a similar...
I don't know if you can find as many, but the thing to remember that these are sentencing enhancements that the prosecutors have discretion to trigger, right? I mean, this is part of the plea bargain process. The idea that everyone who's eligible for a strike will receive a strike if arrested and charged with the sort of conduct that, if pursued to the full extent of the law, would result in that. I mean, that's just very, very unlikely. I mean, the vast majority of criminal convictions come via plea bargain, and a central aspect of those plea bargains involve the downgrading or dropping of charges altogether. And so it would seem to me that if you actually dug into it, what you'd find is that the vast majority of people who are, seeing their third strike have really seen about 6 or 7 up until that point before that lever's actually pulled. And you do make a good point about, age being a factor, because it is true that people become much less likely to reoffend in older age, which is one of the reasons why it becomes, I think, more important to take full advantage of the incapacitation benefits of criminal offenders who are repeating their offending patterns at a young age, and keep them incarcerated until they get to that point where you start to see the drop off. But it's also important to remind people that even for older offenders, while the recidivism rate drops, it doesn't zero out. It doesn't come close to zeroing out. And if you look at the Bureau of Justice Statistics longitudinal studies on recidivism over a 10-year period, you're looking at recidivism rates well over 50% for every single age group they track, except for 65 and over. But for 65 and over, it's still significant. It's like, somewhere in the range of 35 to 40%, which is not nothing. I just recently started writing an essay that I'm almost done working on. And one of the cases that I talk about was the case of Marceline Harvey that was covered by the New York Times. This was an 83-year-old parolee who is now charged with murder again, after being paroled in 2019 for a murder that this person was convicted of in 1985, which came after being paroled for a murder this person was convicted of committing in 1963. And so, there is such a thing as life course persistent criminality there. And in today's day and age where, you can use a gun, it doesn't take a lot of strength or testosterone to pull a trigger. And so, again, the risk definitely goes down. We should keep that in mind. That should inform our sentencing decisions for sure. But it doesn't zero out. That's important to remember. So yeah, I mean, look, maybe three is the wrong number. Maybe it's five. Maybe 25 to life is the wrong amount. Maybe it's 10 to 15. But we clearly have to do more to incapacitate people who are posing a real risk to the safety of those that live in the communities that they're going to spend their time in. Because if you just look at crime in the United States, it's overwhelmingly committed and driven by people who have very, very lengthy criminal histories. I mean, the city of Chicago, there's a study done by the University of Chicago Crime Lab. They looked at people charged with either shootings or homicides in 2015 and 2016. The average person charged with one of those offenses had 12 prior arrests. 20% of them had more than 20 prior arrests. It's hard for me to feel bad about someone with 20 prior arrests facing a third strike, especially when the risk looks the way it does in cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, Indianapolis, Louisville, places of concentrated violence where it's damn near impossible to go about your everyday life if you were just a law-abiding person, where it's damn near impossible to avoid the pull of street violence if you're a kid growing up just trying to go to school and play a sport and just be left alone. Very few people have a sense of what that's like, to resist that sort of pressure, what it's like to live on that kind of island where, you're the only 15-year-old on your block who's not really involved.
So here's the argument. Excuse me for interrupting, Ralph.
Yeah.
I'm still in the devil's advocacy mode. And
sure.
Okay, we have a problem. We have a problem of public disorder. Who pays the price for the disorder? The people who can't afford to protect themselves by moving away or building walls or whatever. So that's going to be poor people and minority people disproportionately. We have heterogeneity amongst the potentially offending population, by which I simply mean some people are bad people. That is, they're bad actors. They're doing stuff that's hurting other people. When we catch them, we ought to confine them so that they don't hurt anybody. This is what I'm hearing you say. Mm-hmm. And the devil's advocate reply to that is, okay, you're confining them, but you're not actually fixing them. They eventually get back out. Is what you're doing really helping or not? And you're saying it's at least helping to the extent that the guy who's confined can't hurt anybody else, at least not anybody else outside of prison. Crime goes on inside of prison as well, but that's a second order effect. What me and this devil's advocate wants to say is, yeah, but that's not a solution. That's a Band-Aid. I think of the war on drugs. I think of, we're going to find people who are trafficking in illicit substances and we're going to punish them as a way of trying to extirpate the trade. But I lock one up and another guy comes down on the block. I don't actually stop the trade. I haven't dealt with the underlying structural phenomena that's generating, in this case, trafficking in illicit substances. All I've done is I've got this musical chairs game where I'm taking people off the street. Somebody else is coming in to take their place. The underlying socioeconomic, cultural thing that's driving the phenomenon hasn't shifted. Likewise here, I mean, is it broken homes? Is it failed education? Is it lack of economic opportunity? Is it geographically segregated communities that are kind of closed in on themselves? Is it gangs? Is it guns? Is it a hip hop culture that lionizes certain ways of acting? I'm not addressing any of that by building more prisons and confining these people. So there's an illusion here. So goes this devil's advocate argument. You're not really treating the thing, and there are deleterious negative consequences. And by the way, those people who did those crimes are also people too. Their welfare should count in our calculation. We can't just throw them on a dustbin of human debris and forget about them. We can't just clang the jail door shut and wipe our hands and pretend as if we are somehow doing justice. That's not justice. So
yeah, no, I think
what about that?
It's a fair point. It's an argument I've heard, but you have to stop the bleeding. right? So what if it's a Band-Aid? Are you going to let the patient bleed out because you haven't figured out what's causing the wound? When you see a house on fire, you don't say, well, let's, before we put this out, let's evaluate the, structural integrity of the electrical system that may have caused this. And you do that later. But you have to stop the bleeding. You owe it to these communities to stop the bleeding. You owe it to the 4-year-old who is now being forced to watch TV on the floor rather than on the comfortable couch for fear that a bullet might come through the window and take their head off before they've gotten to kindergarten.
Yeah.
So that's answer number one. Okay, you have to stop the bleeding. So what if it's a Band-Aid? So what if it's a bandage? It helps. It helps. That means something. That matters. Now, in terms of addressing the underlying root causes, yeah, those are important. But one, I think we don't yet fully understand what those root causes are. I think there are a lot of people who mistakenly argue that, this sort of violence that I'm talking about is a function of socioeconomic factors like poverty and unemployment and inequality. I think that's wrong. I don't think the evidence supports that one bit, at least not, to the extent that it's clear. And even if it is clear, I still don't think we have an obvious solution to that. I mean, how many trillions of dollars have we spent on anti-poverty programs over the years? Doesn't seem to be helping North Philadelphia at the moment. Doesn't seem to be helping the west side of Chicago at the moment, right? Rehabilitation, affecting the culture. I mean, how many people truly believe in their heart of hearts that the government knows how to change culture for the better, that it even knows what the right culture is to begin with, let alone how to implement that? It is very easy, I think, for decarceration advocates to rest on this idea that, hey, well, you're not addressing this thing, which, yeah, okay, I'm not. But do you know how to fix that problem? A problem that's proven to be intractable, that is a common denominator across societies, across human history? Because no one's been able to figure it out yet. What I do know is that over the course of the 1990s, cities like my home city of New York cut crime an enormous amount, and that those benefits really, really mattered. They really helped. I mean, we went from 2,262 murders in 1990 to 292 in 2017. That is a massive 90+% decline. Did we figure out how to solve poverty, how to solve unemployment, how to solve inequality, how to fix the culture? I have yet to read that story of New York's crime decline. No, what we did was we invested in police, we invested in our criminal justice system, and when people were caught doing terrible things, which they were much more likely to be caught doing as a result of our investments in police, we took them off the street and we kept them there for a while. And that gave these communities the room to breathe, the room to grow, the room to fortify themselves against future crime increases, even in the face of eroding all of those institutions that provided those public safety benefits, which is one of the reasons the sky hasn't quite fallen yet in New York.
Okay, just on that point, don't we see a decline in homicides across the board in American cities over that same period of time? And how do you know that what was being done distinctively in New York City, whether it be policing or otherwise, quote unquote, caused the remarkable decline in homicide victimization that you call attention to here?
Yeah, well, one, I think New York served as a model. So lots of other jurisdictions around the country followed in New York's footsteps in many ways. And so it's not at all surprising that we started to see the homicide decline that New York saw catch on in other parts of the country. Lots of jurisdictions were experimenting with, harsher crime control policies, things like 3 strikes, things like truth in sentencing, more investments in police. You had the 94 crime bill added, nearly 100,000 police officers to American streets. That wasn't just here in New York. You had the development of CompStat here in New York that, was adopted by police departments across the country. But it is true that in the early 1990s and through the mid 1990s, New York's decline far superseded that of any other jurisdiction in the country. It outpaced everywhere else, and it lasted longer. It has proven to be much more resilient, this model, which was bought into, I think, in a way that just, hasn't been. I mean, Philadelphia just broke an all-time homicide record last year. Chicago hit a number on homicides last year that it hadn't seen since 1995. Indianapolis, all-time homicide record. Louisville, all-time homicide record. So Yeah, I mean, these things matter. But, I mean, even left-wing outlets like, the Sentencing Project, for example, put, 25% of the crime decline over the course of the 1990s in the US at the lap of incarceration's buildup. Even they admit, hey, incarceration seems to be responsible for somewhere in the range of 25% of our nation's homicide decline over the decade of the 1990s. That's a major benefit, especially when you consider the fact that that sort of problem is not one that is evenly distributed, right? I mean, we talk about crime in the US, crime in New York, crime in Chicago, as if
Yeah.
it's, we talk about it in the aggregate as if it's experienced in the aggregate. But you know as well as I do that the vast majority of any jurisdiction in the country is as safe as the safest places in the world. What we failed to appreciate, I think, in these debates is how hyper concentrated, both geographically and demographically, crime really is, particularly serious violent crime like shootings, homicides, aggravated assaults. In New York City, for example, this is a minimum of 95% of all shooting victims every single year for which we have data, which goes back to 2008, are either Black or Hispanic. Almost all of them are male. A minimum. That is one of the starkest, most persistent racial disparities that you will ever see in the criminal justice data sphere. And it's even more stark because it's not just all Blacks or Hispanics. It's really Blacks or Hispanics between the ages of, say, 15 to 25 that account for the majority of these. Geographically in New York City and really in any city in the US, about 3.5% to 4% of street segments are going to see about 50% of all violent crime. Right. So when we talk about, the sort of downside risk of incarceration, or when we talk about the benefits of the crime decline, we're talking about benefits that inured primarily to the betterment of very, very narrow slices of our communities, the slices of our communities that needed those things the most because they were suffering the brunt of that crime problem to begin with. And so it's an even more pronounced victory by virtue of the fact that it uniquely benefited the least advantaged of us.
Okay. Let's talk about policing. I saw you had a piece that's been much noticed with the legendary police official Bill Bratton. You're there in New York City, where Bratton was commissioner at one time, where Ray Kelly was commissioner. I can remember Kelly coming up to Brown to give a lecture in, I think, 2013 or so, and being shouted down by people because of stop and frisk. There was all this furor about stop and frisk, zero tolerance, broken windows, all of these policing theories. New York City has been a laboratory. What do you think the police have been getting right in the amidst all of this controversy and demands for reform and agitation for defunding the police and concerns about police brutality and state violence and the perpetrated by police officers? What are police getting right, and what's wrong with the defund the police argument from your point of view? You say decarceration, depolicing. These are the things you're against. What would you do about policing?
So, yeah, it's a big question. I mean, I think that what police have gotten largely right over the years, over recent history, is they have learned to use data to inform their deployment strategies. And that has allowed them to concentrate their resources disproportionately in the areas and communities that need them the most. I am old enough to remember, although I am still a young man, when the sort of main critique of American policing was that it wasn't responsive enough to Black crime, right? Public Enemy 911 is a joke. J. Cole's out here making references to, how quickly police respond to 911 calls in white neighborhoods. It still prevails today, that notion. And so, police responded to those concerns and they used data to make the most of their resources. And we now live in a world in which the Upper West Side of Manhattan, isn't getting as much attention as Brownsville, Brooklyn, and that's a good thing. They also professionalized. And that is, I think, one of the most important and understated developments. I mean, policing became a professional institution, not just a blue collar city job. And that was reflected in outcomes. It was also reflected in, you know, the way in which police carried themselves in the field. They became much more likely to not use force, for example, in situations where force was unwarranted. I mean, look at, the NYPD, 1971. I think they shot and wounded 220 some odd people. Now they fire their weapons at maybe a dozen people in a given year. The amount of people that are killed by the department is in the single digits, and that's been the case for many, many years now. That's a major development. Many more people are taken into custody, even armed suspects, with very little incident. And I think that is a major improvement. Now, it's interesting because those are the things that the defunders kind of seize on. This is their main critique. The police use of force, police violence is too common. This is what drives their concerns. And, when you ask me what's wrong with defunding the police, I mean, my brain almost short-circuited because I don't know where to start. Everything is wrong with it. It is, an idea that is proposed, in contravention of everything that the literature says, of everything that we know about what increasing police presence, about what increasing investments in policing produces. And that's crime declines. I mean, every single study of increasing police physical presence in an area shows declines in crime in that area. Every single study of any merit that shows, that looks at the effect of investments in police shows significant returns on those investments. And again, those are returns that are going to inure primarily to the benefit of the least advantaged communities. I mean, there was a study that was published last year by Morgan Williams and Aaron Chalf and a few other economists, and they found that the addition of just one police officer in the country would abate 0.1 homicides. So one homicide for every police officer added to the beat. But the effects were twice as large for Black Americans than they were for white Americans. That's an important point. Policing has become one of the few institutions that is extremely responsive to one of the most important social problems facing low-income minority communities. And we eschew those benefits at our peril. The idea that we ought to deny these communities the benefits of placing the most obvious form of a capable guardian on the street to reduce crime is just indefensible to me in every way, morally, but also just empirically, if you are being honest about what the data says. So yeah, it's just an incredibly misguided idea, and the fact that it is proposed in light of these cases of admittedly terrible police violence is really frustrating, because that argument pretends that those cases are representative of the institution, and they're not. There was a survey that came out a couple years ago, sort of at the height of everything post George Floyd. I think it was like some significant portion of self-identifying liberal Americans thought that like somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 unarmed Blacks were killed by police in a given year, which is absolutely insane, because the reality is that the number's right around 12 to 15, sometimes as high as 25 in a given year, which is a very, very different story. I mean, people just have it in their head that, violence, particularly deadly violence, is a likely outcome of a police-citizen encounter, or particularly of an enforcement encounter, and that likelihood is much, much higher if the individual is Black. And the reality is that police use of force of any kind, deadly or not deadly, is an extremely rare occurrence. If you just look at how often police fire their weapons, I estimated based on 2018 data that there were a little over 3,000 purposeful police shootings that year. Sounds like a lot. It's 8 a day.
That's in New York City.
No, just in the country.
Oh,
in the country.
Is that right? Only 3,000?
Only 3,000 in the country. I mean, we only about 900 or so people, 950 people were killed that year by police. I mean, I say only. I mean, obviously, any one person killed, is a tragedy. But the idea that this is a common outcome. Police made 10.3 million arrests that year.
Yeah.
That's the use of deadly force in like 0.03% of those arrests, and
Yeah.
non-deadly force is not much more likely.
You know, I noticed that in Roland Fryer, the economist, the Harvard economist who's done path-breaking work, data out of Houston, Texas, trying to estimate the racial effect on police using deadly force. And he finds small or zero differences between black and white in the likelihood that police would use deadly force. But it's also the case that the overall likelihoods are very, very small numbers. I mean, they're, 0.001 kind of numbers.
Yep.
So there is that. But Roland also finds that in the use of force short of deadly force, that there is a statistically significant 25% or so more likely that force short of deadly force, throwing people against cars, cuffing them, using a baton or whatever.
Right.
And he's very concerned about that. He thinks that that is the source of some of the poor relations between minority communities and police that we see, lack of cooperation with police and trying to resolve crimes and so on. So what do you say about that, about a culture in policing that seems to treat with less dignity and respect citizens of color whom they encounter and so on? Nothing to that?
Yeah. No, I think there's obviously something to that, something that we should worry about. But again, it's a problem that has to be viewed in context. You mentioned how rare of an occurrence police shootings were.
Yeah.
And while lesser uses of force are much more common than police shootings, they are still very, very rare. So there's one study in the book that I think illustrates this really well. It's a study that looks at 1 million calls for service across 3 police departments, one in North Carolina, one in Arizona, and one in Louisiana. Those 1 million calls for service resulted in 114,000 criminal arrests over a 2-year period. Police used any force whatsoever in less than 1% of affecting those arrests, which is on par with the data that's reported by departments around the country. Right. So even non-deadly uses of force, less serious uses of force, is still a very, very rare occurrence. Now, it matters that when it does occur, there is a statistically significantly higher likelihood that it will be used against a Black subject as compared to a white subject in a way that there does not seem to be an obvious explanation that's race neutral for why. But it doesn't necessarily mean that every single one of those are the result of racial animus on the part of the officers engaging in that action, right? It could be that these officers, at least some of them, are working in high crime areas, and as by virtue of their prior experience are just more worried about a suspect resisting if he fits a certain profile, and so they're just much more likely to go hands-on earlier in the encounter out of what they call statistical bias, right? As opposed to just actual animus based on race. Now, that's not to excuse it. It still matters. And it matters for precisely the reason that Roland points out, which is that this is going to inform how communities feel about this institution. And if you want them to cooperate, if you want to sort of, help minimize the prevalence of the no snitching ethic, it really matters when you perpetuate the kind of ideas that some people have in their heads about what a police officer's presence means in a low income minority community. So yeah, it's something that we should be concerned about. It's something that we should address, but it's a problem that we shouldn't overstate. And it's a problem that does not justify the kind of dismantling of this institution that people are proposing in response to its existence. There are just better ways to go about this. And it's important that we acknowledge the significant amount of progress that's been made on this front. That it matters that police are significantly less likely to use force against anyone of any race or creed today than they were 20 years ago. What I think is unfortunate is you don't see the institution getting any credit for that, right? I mean, if you just look at the intensity of the protests, outside New York City precincts in the wake of George Floyd's murder, you'll find just as much intensity as you would have found in 1968 in
Yeah.
the city of Chicago, even though the institution has become so much better on this front.
How do you explain that? What accounts for the uniform, in my experience, posture of African Americans, especially looking at the law enforcement issues? We got to give our kids the talk. We have to make a point of training the kids so that they know what to do, because an encounter with a police officer is intrinsically a dangerous thing. You're a black man, you could lose your life. On the statistics that you're calling attention to, that's preposterous. It's preposterous that a person, in virtue simply of being black, should fear a police officer if they pull them over for a speeding ticket. And yet that attitude is very, very widespread. People like you complain about the George Soros, so-called George Soros DAs, people who've gotten money from the Open Society Foundation or whatever, like a Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, or Chesa Bodine in San Francisco, who's been recalled or whatever. And they complain about this, but those people got elected. They ran for office, Bragg in Manhattan, ran for office on a platform of, I'm going to decarcerate, I'm going to pull back, I'm going to lighten up on the punitive dimension of law enforcement, and people voted them into office. Say their names, Breonna, Eric Garner, these become iconic. They're culturally salient. You turn on the television for a TV show and you see the plot of the show reflecting the sense of the oppressive presence of policing. When in fact an argument could be made: you don't like mass incarceration, you want more police. We're underinvesting in policing relative to incarceration when you consider the entire mix of responses that we might make to problems of crime and disorder. And you could, how many black lives were saved in New York City when that homicide rate went from that high of over 2,000 to under 300 in the course of a decade or so? How many black lives were saved? Don't the police deserve credit for that? They don't get it. They don't get it at the New York Times. They don't get it in the movie and entertainment industries, a depiction of life on the street, and so forth and so on. So, long prelude by me to ask you the question: the politics of anti-police animus, especially in minority communities in American big cities, set that against the reality of what the police are doing and what the real threats to Black lives are. How do you account for that?
Yeah, it's hard to, and it's frustrating. I suspect that it has something to do with the fact that every generation wants to be seen as standing for something, and what better thing to stand for than to stand against the man, right? Against the power structure. That's how we define our morality in this country. Everyone's got to, have a fight, and if you're sitting on the sidelines, silence is violence, right? And so I think that's a big part of why this continues to happen. But I also think, people like Larry Krasner, Chesa Boudin, Alvin Bragg, they got elected, but not with huge majorities. These are still very low salience elections, often in, off year elections, not on cycle with the federal elections. Larry Krasner, I think 17% of the eligible voters turned out in the Democratic primary to reelect him recently. I think people haven't quite yet caught on to the importance of some of these races, which is part of the brilliance of the Soros strategy over the last, half decade, in sort of pursuing reform through the route of electing prosecutors, because it's just not a race that a lot of people pay attention to. I mean, I can't tell you how many calls I got after Alvin Bragg was elected of people saying, I had no idea. It's like, well, you should have had an idea. It was right there on his website. Well, I didn't look at his website. I mean, Eric Adams won the primary. I thought everyone was kind of on the same page. It's like, there are a couple things going on. One is, I think our polity doesn't pay enough attention to some of these things, and so they're still catching up. There's some lag. But I do think that there is something to the idea that just culturally, it has become sort of central to, progressive identities that are acceptable in elite circles, that you have to stand against, the power structure. And what's ironic about that is the degree to which, progressive elites fail to recognize that they are the power structure. They're the ones wielding the power. They're the ones who have people in fear of speaking the truth. They're the ones who can determine if and when somebody loses their job if they say the wrong thing. They're the ones who can keep people, off of faculties if they have the wrong ideas. I mean, so yeah, I think it's going to change eventually. At least I hope. I think the pendulum will swing back. But the hope is that we learn from our history, and every time that the pendulum swings past the point of equilibrium, it doesn't go as far as it did the last time, and therefore doesn't take as long to come back. What I hope we don't see is the kind of violent, back and forth and backlashes that we've seen throughout history, because that just doesn't do us any good.
I understand that your father was a police officer in New York City.
Yeah, he was more than 20
What happened
years.
when you told him that you were thinking of following? You
Yeah.
tell a story. You told him you were thinking of following in his footsteps. How did he take that?
Yeah. I mean, I didn't even really put it that way. For me, it was my own footsteps. I was always fascinated by that world. I think the fact that he was a cop when I was a kid had a lot to do with it, especially at that time, right? I mean, I'm born in 1986, so late 80s, early 90s. Brooklyn is dangerous place. I'm watching movies, Charles Bronson, the whole thing, and it's like, wow, my dad is like part of this, and that was always fascinating to me. And so I took the LSAT and the NYPD exam my senior year of college, and I did well on both. And so it was a decision that I had to make. Do I, become a New York City police officer, or do I go to law school? And I told my dad, hey, like I did really well on this NYPD exam. They give you a list number, it's called, based on your score in the cohort, and that determines the order in which you get hired. And my list number was 1, so I got the highest score in the cohort. And I was very excited about this because I remembered my dad saying that his list number was like 14,000 or something like that. And so I broached it, bragging a little bit, and I expected to have a good laugh with him, but his face changed. He was upset and frightened and concerned. And this isn't, recent. This is 2010. And what he said to me back then is what I think you'll hear a lot of cops say during exit interviews today, which is like, you think you're going to go out there and save the world, and the reality is that any good thing you do will be immediately forgotten by the community the second that one of your colleagues does something that they don't like. God forbid you're 8 years into this job and you get caught in a controversial use of force. You're now on the front page of every newspaper. The department throws you under the bus, and now you lose your job having spent the last decade developing experiences that don't translate into any other line of work. What are you going to do then? This was his admonishment. He basically threatened to never talk to me again. He was very, very adamant that I not take what he saw was a major risk with my life and career. He said, you should just go to law school, avoid this, take a sort of job where people are actually going to say thank you at the end of the day. And this is a man who I know still cares about the work that he did. He joined the NYPD in 1983, kind of at the height of everything that was going wrong. Even over the period of safety that we experienced, we still had 2 close family friends lose their lives in the line of duty to an unarmed black man, I might mention. We hear that phrase a lot in these debates, unarmed black man, as if the fact that someone's unarmed when they come into contact with the police means that they can't pose a deadly threat. Well, a really good man named Bobby Parker lost a fight for his gun with an unarmed black man who took his life and then took the life of his partner, Patrick Rafferty, in 2004, September 10th. The anniversary just passed. So, these are experiences that certainly color my work. I think in the end, I probably made the right decision not becoming a cop, but I do worry about a world in which, people with higher degrees of education, higher levels of psychological stability, more ambition, don't take that kind of job. I don't want it to become the kind of job where the only people who take it are those who feel like they have nothing to lose or less to lose. That's not going to produce good outcomes.
What proportion of the NYPD are college graduates?
A much
What?
higher one now. I'd probably put it at over 50%. But I'm guessing, the NYPD many years ago adopted a requirement that you had to have 60 college credits in order to be eligible for employment.
So that's like
That's
2 years.
2 years an associate's degree basically, and so a lot of officers just go ahead and finish their degrees, in part because the at least for a time there was so much demand for that job that back when I was applying, when I took the exam, the lag time between when you took your exam and when you were likely to get hired was close to 2 years. So you had some time to go ahead and finish your degree. And I think, people who were ambitious about the future of their careers knew that they wanted to sort of climb the ladder. And so it paid, to pursue higher education, also in part because the NYPD had programs that would pay for that pursuit if you did it while you were on the job, at night. This is very different from the NYPD my father joined. My dad dropped out of high school, got his GED and became a cop. So and it's interesting because there is research showing, for example, that police officers who have higher levels of education, particularly college degrees or higher, are much less likely to use force than police officers without a college degree in the same situation, which I think is important because we're in a moment in our history where we are demonizing a profession in a way that makes it much less likely that people with options will take the job. And that's exactly who you want to take the job if you care about these outcomes. And so, it's a bit ironic.
Yeah. So I saw your interview with Peter Robinson on Uncommon Knowledge. And thanks, by the way, for coming out to Dallas to join us for that Old Parkland conference, which was a great event last May.
Highlight of my career, Glenn, for sure. To be in those rooms with people like you and Justice Thomas, and to be on stage with Roland Fryer and Judge Brown. I mean, yeah.
So he said Roland did something that really struck me. He said, if you take, because he's done this study of the impact of federal investigations of local police departments on crime, Roland Fryer, and in a paper joint with Tanea Devi, finds that if there is a viral incident involving a police shooting or killing, and then that triggers a response of federal investigation, that the net effect of that is to lead to higher crime in the subsequent months and years, because police being investigated withdraw and pull back and don't have as much encounter with citizens, doing the kinds of things that would prevent crime from taking place in the first place. They're less aggressive. They don't make as many stops. They're not as responsive. And whenever I tell my lovely wife, who is a left of center political junkie, about this finding, she goes ballistic and says it's like they're going on strike. It's like the police are going on strike in place. They're refusing to work. They're public employees who are refusing to work. Damn them. If they were teachers going on strike, you right-wingers, this is my old lady, you right-wingers would be, we're having a friendly exchange. We love each other. We kiss and make up. You right-wingers would be all over the teachers for withdrawing and not doing their job and sitting on their butts. Well, what about these cops? And I want to put the question to you. If Roland is right, that police are electing to disengage to some degree because they don't want to do the kind of things needed to keep crime from happening, because they would expose themselves potentially to risk, and they think no one has their back, like your father says, that they're going to be hung out to dry. If their unions are trying to keep officers from being held accountable when they do make mistakes and making all kinds of excuses for them, if a thin blue line is of solidarity among police officers is keeping those who are doing the right thing from being responsible in terms of reporting bad behavior by their fellows and so on like that, isn't the anti-police sentiment that you find someplace to some degree justified? Haven't the police officers to some degree brought this public suspicion upon themselves?
No, for a lot of reasons. One is that the suspicion has been there way before pullbacks and blue flus became a thing. But two, I think they're mischaracterizing what's going on. These aren't police officers going on strike. They are responding, I think, to a very legitimate risk, a risk that's unreasonable in their view. It's fear. It's not indignation. It's fear. It's fear that if I get out of my car here and investigate this person who looks suspicious, and it turns out that there's nothing going on and I'm wrong, now I risk being pictured as a racist. This is something that's going to contribute to this department's decline in the future because it's going to go down as a false positive, right? It's going to go down as just another example of, police officer seeing, let's say a black teenager and acting
Yeah.
on all the, sort of racist stereotypes that we all are angry about, right? So there's fear. There's also fear that if this turns out to be legitimate and my hunch is right, and now I have to make an arrest and this person resists and I have to use force, that this might not look so good on camera. And if it gets picked up by the local paper and then by the New York Times, I might be hung out to dry. And there are a whole bunch of people saying, let's get rid of, qualified immunity and let's, make it easier to fire cops. I mean, I have a family. Maybe I don't take that risk. Doesn't mean I'm not going to respond to 911 calls or calls for help. It doesn't mean I'm going to ignore blatant criminal activity in my view, but am I going to do the things that I think we should want police officers to do, to be proactive and actually sussing out criminal activity that's not obvious to the naked eye? I think it's fear. And that fear matters because it's a calculation that is driven by real phenomenon that we can control, that's within our control. Whether or not we launch an investigation as a way to appease, the people that we see as our main political supporters is within our control. And if you care about public safety more than you do about politics, I think you read Roland's paper and you come to the conclusion that, hey, maybe there's a better way to go about trying to get the results that we want, and just, saying, hey, we're going to go after these bad guys at a news conference that's going to be, played on CNN and MSNBC, isn't the best way to go about it, even if it is the best way to get people to make donations to, your political party.
Yeah, what does Roland say? He says, if we're going to reform, let's do it with the police, not on the police.
Not to the police, right? Yeah.
Not to the police, yeah.
Yeah, I think he's right. I think he's right.
That's the case, listeners, that's the case for not decarcerating and not depolicing, admirably put by Rafael Mangual, who is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, my colleague, and I hope someday to be able to say my friend.
Indeed.
Thank you, Ralph.